Thank you all for being here. My name is Richard Gianelli. I'm on the Board of Directors of Danbury Children's First, and I'm also Vice Chair of the Board of Education for the City of Danbury. I thank you all for being here tonight. And I think you'll have a very, very informative evening. We have a very elaborate panel here. I just want to speed up the meeting. I want to introduce you to our Executive Director of Danbury Children's First, Linda Costa. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick. My name is Linda Consco. I'm the director at Danbury Children First. Just briefly want to welcome you all. Thanks for coming. The purpose of tonight is to get information about the City of Danbury education budget, how it's funded, and also an opportunity to hear from the people who have the most knowledge and who are decision makers about funding and about the education system itself at this table. You couldn't have a better panel than the people that are here, and we're very grateful that they could join us. And I'm just going to briefly introduce them and just tell you how the program is going to run this evening. First of all, we have our Honorable Mayor, Mark Boughton, from the City of Danbury. We have Dr. Sal Pascarella, our Superintendent of Schools, on the end. Chair of the Board of Education, Irving Fox. State Representatives Joe Taversack. State Representative Bob Godfrey. State Representative Jen Geidler. And State Representative Dan Carter. And so we welcome them all and appreciate the time that you're taking tonight to be with us. So what we're going to do is we're going to have some presentations first. It won't be more than an hour of presentations. And then we're going to open it up for questions. So if you have any questions at all, I don't know if you have something to write them down, but try to remember them and you can ask. If you want the handout that Dr. Pascarella is going to be speaking from, it is in the back, it's stapled, it's about 12 pages. And in there is a lot of information. We may not be able to get into every detail on every page because tonight we have to be a little brief because we want to get to your questions and because we have so much information that we want to share with you tonight. This is a follow-up from a forum we had in January, and the people at the January forum, I know a lot of you, some of you are here tonight, we said we really need to bring the state legislators into the discussion. So I hope it's helpful, and there's contact information for all the legislators and city council people in the materials in the back. Some of it's in Dr. Pascarella's handout as well. All right, thank you very much, and so now I'd like to introduce the Mayor of Danbury, who's going to talk about a little bit, I think, about the city budget process and education, how that fits in, and maybe some ideas about how we could do better to get resources for education.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out today. We appreciate you taking your time. Sorry about the 5 snowflakes that are falling out there, but I said to somebody in the way, and I go, "Say enough snow." And I go, "No, we want some more." And no, just so you know, it's about $25,000 an inch every time it snows, so you can just kind of see your tax dollars falling. It's as pretty as it is. Anyways, I want to spend just a couple of quick minutes updating you as to where we are in our process and talk a little bit about what the process is and what I anticipate happening going forward. The City of Danbury, our budgeting cycle, we run on a fiscal year of July 1 to June 30th, so we're in our mid-cycle of this budget, but we've already have begun planning for next year's budget. In fact, that planning starts about November, October. I actually backed it up a month because this is going to be such a difficult budget going forward. And all of our data has been collected from our departments, including the Board of Ed, who submitted they're required to submit their budget to my office by no later than, I think it's February 15th. So it's hand-delivered, ready to go, all adopted, wrapped in a bow for us. So what happens then? Well, here's what I thought I'd just give you just a really quick, because we have a lot of folks who want to talk tonight, a really quick overview of what some of the challenges that we're facing both on the school side and the city side, and then talk to you a little bit about what the impact of the governor's budget would be on what we're trying to do. Okay, so the net is this, the board started out about, and correct me if I'm wrong, some of the board members, about needing about $5 million more, maybe a little bit more than that, next year than they got this year, just to maintain existing services that they have. It's basically essentially a status quo budget. I think that's pretty accurate on this one. Right, okay, so that's how they started. They worked really hard and got that number down through a variety of different cost savings measures and ideas and things to about, I think 4.2 was their final request. So 4.2, up to that concept, $4.2 million more in this year. If we were to generate that in tax revenue, would require about $200 million worth of building out in the community. Okay, so you can pretty much figure that there hasn't been $200 million worth of building in the community given the economy. Okay, so that's the school side. On the city side, as we crunch our numbers, we figure that we're going to need about $4 million to maintain existing services as you see them. So that leaves a total delta of about $8 million in operational expenses to be able to close the number, which would mean about $400 million of new construction in the city of Danbury, which you know simply hasn't happened. So that's the challenge that sort of lays before us to be able to deliver the services that we want to deliver. On top of that, we've seen a significant escalation in things like insurance costs, healthcare costs, which we've been out. Both Kim Thompson's here, and she works closely with our Human Resources Department to put out a single package, even though it's different plans. We talk a lot and cross-pollinate ideas back and forth to try to save money on the bidding of the health insurance for our employees. Let me give you the scope of how big health insurance has gone up. When I took office back in 2001, health insurance for all of our employees, including our retirees, was somewhere around $6.5 million. Today, as I stand here, health insurance for this year coming up for all of our employees and our retirees is about $16 million. So you've seen a dramatic, just like you did at home, escalation in the cost of delivering health care. So that's a challenge for us. The other challenge that we have is our pension funds, which you've heard a lot about this on the state level and many municipalities across Connecticut and across the country. In order for us to maintain our 100% level of our pension funds, we have to make a contribution to the pension funds for our employees. We've never had to do that before because we've always been traditionally overfunded. But when the stock market goes from 14,500 to 6,800, that's a significant hit that we took over the last couple of years. Now, there's been a clawback in over the last year or so, and that's been good, and it's minimized that. But to give you a scope of dollars, we'll have to put in about $7 million next year into our pension funds to make sure that the money will be there going forward. All those are challenges that we have to meet in addition to the operational expenses. On top of all that, we are in negotiations now with all of our unions. Part of our challenge, without divulging too much of our strategy, will be, hey, look, these are costs that continue to escalate that we need to get under control. Be they through pension or through healthcare, retiree medical, or critical costs for the city and ultimately for you as taxpayers, and they're just simply not sustainable going forward. They're not sustainable. So we're going to have to make changes to ensure that they are sustainable for the community. The governor rolled out his budget last week, on Wednesday, and in his budget, it was basically, I would say, a real solid effort to try to keep municipalities whole. In other words, not lose any money than what you had last year, but it would be difficult for us to be able to gain a lot more money than what we had last year. And as I just outlined for you, the challenges we face, that sort of puts the pressure on us internally. What this means is that if the budget was adopted as presented by the governor, assuming that all the revenue projections are correct or whatever, we would pick up about $1.2 million in new dollars that we didn't have this year. So our $8 million delta is about $7 million right now, and that's what we're basically going at. We did take a significant cut in the governor's budget, something called the manufacturing machinery exemption. Means about $1.5 million to the city of Danbury that we won't get that grant next year that we get every year. They are working on a fix for that. We're not sure how that's going to all play out. But again, just apples to apples, if we put this budget through, that's what we make for the city. So we're going to continue to grind away on these numbers. This is crunch time for me. You can find me at City Hall early on Saturday mornings. It's a nice quiet time Friday mornings, and I've got my little green shade, and I got the little style calculator, and I'm adding it up and making sure that, hey, we minimize the impact of this economy on our homeowners, because unfortunately our foreclosures are at an all-time high in the city of Danbury. People are losing their homes, and that's going to be a challenge. for all of us. I'll give you an example. When I took office in '01, I think we had 3 foreclosures in the entire year of 2002. This year, we're on track to have about 180. So the fact of the matter is that that's a direct result, a direct reflection on the downturn in the economy. People can't pay the mortgage. If you add a significant tax increase on top of that, now they really can't pay the mortgage, they're going to lose their home. So it's a tough choice for the city council, for our legislators, and for our Board of Ed members. We want great schools and positive experience for our kids, but on the other hand, we don't want to push people out because when they leave school and have a positive experience, they're going to be living in shelter. And that's just simply not acceptable. So this is the challenge before us. I'm not trying to be doom and gloom. I just kind of want to let you know what we're thinking about as we put this budget together. But with that, I'll be available for questions. I got a lot of folks who want to say stuff, so Linda, we'll pass the
We're going to go to Irving Fox for this school.
All right.
But before we do that, can we just introduce Senator Mike McLaughlin? Mike, we've got a seat right
Come on
over
over here,
there
Mike.
and a bottle of water for you.
We got you covered.
Thank you very much for coming.
Okay, sit next to Sal.
Well, the mayor was
You can sit there, it's fine. Just a couple other quick numbers you might want to keep in your mind. And Sal, I don't see Leo here, but Bill, if I'm wrong. Generally, the cost of educating a student per year is about $12,000 per kid. So we have $12,000 per child per year. After, I just talked to a taxpayer the other day. It's a funny story, and I'll pass the mic over to Irving. They came up to me and said, you know, I'm concerned about my taxes. I said, look, I'm always concerned about taxes. Nobody wants to raise taxes, right? And he says, yeah, you know, I got 3 kids. I said, well, you got 3 kids, God. You know, how old are they, whatever? And he said, well, they're in school. I said, okay. Well, think of it this way. You're paying how much? It's about $4,200 a year. By the way, Danbury has some of the lowest effective property tax rates in the state, just so we're clear about that. And when we're done, we'll still have some of the lowest effective property tax rates in the state. So I said, well, look at it this way. You're paying in $4,200. You got 3 kids. You're getting $36,000 worth of services for the city, not counting police, fire, and all that other stuff that we do. That's like the best deal in the world. You should be like, thanking me. So they kind of walked out scratching his head and goes, you might be right. So I think part of that, what I'm saying is we need to educate folks about where their dollar goes, about how the fact that this Board of Ed is not wasting your dollars, how the city of Danbury obsesses over every little switch, every little light bulb, every nickel that we spend, because we understand and we're sensitive to that this is ultimately your money and we need to be accountable to you in how we spend it. With that, I'm going to throw it over to my good friend Irving Fox, Chairman of the Board, just like Frank Sinatra.
Thank you, Mayor Brown. I won't start singing. That would be a disaster. Worse than any snowstorm. Just want to backtrack a little bit because where the Board of Education comes into play in terms of the budget process, and for those of you who were at the first meeting in January would know that much of our initial work happens with several unknowns. As the Mayor mentioned, by the time February 15th passes, we're due to hand in a budget to the Mayor's office. But there, at that time, we were at the 9th where we actually voted on the budget. Several factors are unknown to the board at the time this happens. We don't know how much the city can afford to fund the schools at with any level of specificity. We also don't know what the state is going to be able to fund us coming out of Hartford. Some of that's changed with the governor's budget address that took place, I think it was last week or the week before. Knowing that the ECS funding, which is the funding the state gives towards the schools, consumes about 17 to 20% of our expenditure, that's a pretty large number in and of itself. And with the state facing the budget crunch that they have, that is a big unknown. So even after the governor's budget address, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussion up in Hartford over the next several months on what the final budget is going to come in at. But at the time we were deliberating, we don't even really have an idea what that number is going to be. And then couple that with the federal monies that we receive, some of that is known, and we have about $3 million of federal funding that we know is going away. And with no pipeline in the future to replace that, these are the factors that we have to consider in February when we submit a budget. And so as the mayor indicated, and as we've mentioned before, what the board passed, we can call it a status quo budget, but it really isn't status quo. Mainly because our enrollment is increasing. So if we had the same number of students and we're doing the same for the students as we did this year, it would be status quo. But over the last several years, our enrollment has grown 100, 200 per year, and that's only expected to increase. We have demographic studies that show a general increase that's expected in our school population, which bucks the trend of the state, pretty much statewide. Many districts are shrinking, but that's not the case here in Danbury. And so couple that with the difficult financial environment that's faced by all levels of government, and you can see the quandary that we're all in terms of trying to provide the best education for our students at a reasonable cost to the taxpayer with services that the governmental entities can afford to provide. And that's a very high challenge for all of us at every level of government. So where we're at now, we've passed this budget which maintains the current level of services, but it also absorbs the federal funding that's going away, trying to keep the services level. Understanding what cost factors we do know our health insurance is going up. We don't know exactly what by yet. One of the cost savings we continue to look for is in the health insurance field. And so the superintendent's proposed budget is 4.2% increase. By the time we got to the board meeting, we had negotiated the increase from 12 down to 9%. And so the board took out about another $600,000 off the request. So we're down to about $118 million, which is 3.65% increase over the current year. And a good chunk of that is related to the health insurance premium increases that we're still expecting to see come this fall. So that's where we're at now. We wait the mayor's budget address to see, when you put all the pieces together, what that looks like. And then we're going to have to come back to the table and look at what the board will need to do with the final allocation that we're going to end up with. And that's going to require some hard decisions and some hard choices. But as we mentioned before, and that's why we solicit the public's input, and that we'll have many more discussions like this before the budget cycle is completed. So without further ado, I don't want to take up too much time, but to leave enough time for questions, we'll pass it on to our state legislators. Or to Sal. So I'll pass it on to the superintendent of schools, Sal Pasquarello. Sal.
Thank you. I don't have much more to say other than to tell everyone out here, because there's a lot of information you're hearing about Wisconsin and what's going on in Madison. Our teachers here for next year have taken a 0. Our administrators have taken a 0. The cabinet has taken a 0. The 0 and the mayor is taking a 0. I mean, I think everybody's gotten it in Danbury. It's we know how challenged everyone is. But what you need to be concerned as parents, for us, and the board has been very mindful of saying, whatever we do, let's try to keep teachers in classrooms. So we're really trying to do that. But even at that, we're really challenged. And the budget is a non-slide budget, we call it. We're trying not to go backwards, but our class sizes, it does vary from school to school. Parents ought to get upset at that, but if you have 3 sections, you can divide your kids differently than when you have 2 sections, teachers in a school. But pretty much our elementary, our K and 1, we're scheduling at 22, and we used to be K3. Now it's 2 on up. It's going to be around 24, 25. High school varies. We have some courses at the high school with lower numbers because we have a comprehensive high school. If you offer 4 years and you have multivariable physics that you have to offer, then you put it in, the kids take it, it might be 16 or 17. You may have some lower courses that have less kids, but by and large, those classes are running about 30 in a class, 25 to 30, no more than about 125. The middle school is also as crowded here. So we're doing what we can with the resources that we have. What's really helped us was the ERA money that we kept for this year. We received about $1.2 million in September when we opened up school. As Irving mentioned, our enrollment is doing the inverse of Fairfield County and the state. Everything is going down. We're going up. In 2008, we had roughly 9,900 kids. 2009, we had 10,001. 2010, we have 10,003, almost 10,004. So we're moving up quite a bit. So we need to really be attentive to the way that growth factor is going for us. What we're trying to do here is maintain the school sizes, and you're going to hear them talking about future challenges for growth, but that's something that the mayor has put together the 2020 committee, and we're trying to figure out. April 6th or April 7th, there's a meeting, so we can start talking about growth. That's not part of this budget. What's part of this budget is just the operational piece. The jobs money I just mentioned, with the added growth, we needed 6 teachers at the beginning of the year. We had nowhere to go for that other than the operational that we cut back. But what we were able to do was we had $1.2 million Danbury was entitled to. We used about half of it to pay for those teachers, and we banked the other half to help us with next year's, this coming year's, next year's salary account. So that's been helpful to us. So when the mayor budgets us for what, 4 million, 5 million, on 10 million, then we'll give them 600,000 back. But we should be okay with that. For a community, we started out about 4 years ago with a free and reduced lunch population of about 32 to 34%. As of this October, the new numbers, we're at 46%. 46% of our students are on free and reduced lunch. So that's really increased. And, you know, most of us know it's not a case of ethnicity in terms of achievement. It's about their social and economic background, the SES. So kids that come from lower income families need more time. They need more opportunities. And with a shrinking budget, you can see our challenges. But that's what's happening in our schools. So we're challenged that way in terms of providing a quality education for all of our youngsters. Our mobility rate, you're going to hear a little bit about that, is almost 39 to 40% in our district. That means, you know, when some principals, you know, you start school and 39% of your population will be gone. So when you focus your educational programming, some of those kids are gone. They're not here. From 8th grade to 10th grade, when the students in 8th grade, they take the CAP test in 10th grade, have half the population there. So, you know, to make judgments about our programming has been very difficult for us to focus our work. So we're challenged. You know, we're on the improvement list for the state. I would challenge if you would come into our schools and watch the care and dedication and the work that's going on in our elementary, middle, and high school. They're challenged, but they're committed to the work that we do, even though we're considered a district that's in need of improvement. We've outperformed many of we have DERGs, educational reference groups that we have, and our students have outperformed that in our special areas. It's just not enough to get us off this list that NCLB put us on, but the school system is pretty sound. I have nothing else to budget, but I just want to look here because I've got Bill Glass here. Anything? No? Thank you. Thank you.
And before we move on, I just wanted to recognize our other Board of Education members here in attendance this evening. We have Mr. Richard Ginelli, who's our Vice Chair, and he's our Chair of our Community Relations Committee, and Mr. Bob Taversack, who's the Chair of our Policy Committee. So those board members are here this evening as well.
So we're going to do about, for each of you that would like to speak, not more than about 5 minutes. By 8:30, we want to try to keep quick questions.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming. Joe Taversack. It's great to be here, an honor to be here, and I'm glad to see so many people out here today, given the weather and other things you could be doing, that you all care about education enough to be here, so thank you. It's a really difficult time, as you all know. You're hearing a lot about the state budget deficit. I think it's great to see that Governor Malloy has taken a really bold stance on education, preserving education. You've heard about from prior speakers about how he has basically maintained ECS funding, education cost sharing funding, which is basically the foundation of education funding from the state. For those of you that aren't that familiar with it, it's a formula that tries to compensate towns and provide at least a foundation of funding and make adjustments for towns that have different challenges because of factors like poverty and English literacy and things like that. So it's not a perfect formula. In fact, the governor has talked about trying to take a look at it and make some changes there. That's really a kind of a conversation for another day. But what the ECS funding means to Danbury, if the governor's budget, which is a proposal right now, and really that's all it is at this point in time, would give Danbury just a little bit under $23 million per year. That's what I have here. So that's a lot of money. It's significant. The governor also has proposed actually expanded funding in pre-K slots, which is huge. It's really important. I think most educators and people around this issue agree that that's the most important time, pre-kindergarten, to address the achievement gap and try to bring kids up to a common level of skills. So I'm real happy to see that the governor stood up for these two things, and he's really stood up for education, and I'm going to support him on that going forward. For the next couple of months, weeks and months, we're going to have hearings on the budget. Again, the governor's budget proposal is a proposal. I hope that the education piece stays intact, because I think if you care about education, he's taken a great position on education. So I'll be doing what I can to see that that happens, and meeting with the mayor, the Board of Education, Superintendent Pasquarello, and my colleagues here. We always work together on education issues. They really never get political, and I'm happy about that, and I'm sure that's how things will remain this year. But so I will pass this mic along, and again, thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Jay. I'm Bob Godfrey, and we're actually sitting in my district right now, downtown Danbury and all the neighborhoods around it. And let me just kind of give you some of the things that go into establishing our point of view. Our deficit is 20% of our budget, and that's kind of hard to fathom when you're talking about billions of dollars. But kind of imagine first in your house, if all of the paychecks, for over $100 you're bringing home now, you're bringing home 80. You know how devastating that kind of situation is. And you don't have to run prisons, and you don't have to run hospitals, and you don't have a road system, and a lot of other things that we have to provide service for you. So it's really, really difficult. And the best things I've been hearing from our governor, who's been in office all of 6 weeks, is that he's, as a former mayor, he certainly understands how the state budget impacts and interrelates with those of municipalities, cities. And remember, Danbury's a big city. We're 7, I believe now, maybe 6. We'll see what the Census Bureau numbers are in a few weeks. And so he's more than sympathetic. He's empathetic to what boards of education, city councils, boards of selectmen are doing around the state. And he has moved to protect, particularly, the education funding that comes from the state and comes down to all of the school districts. And it's really the only thing he's protected. He's going after the cost of doing business, he's going after payroll, he's going after the size and scope of government. He's doing everything in his power, and he gave us a budget that consists of about 54% cutting in spending and about 46% tax increases. No, I don't like any of the tax increases, and I don't like any of the spending cuts, but I've kind of got to be one of the grown-ups in the room and make the kind of decisions that are going to have to be made. And the point about what he says about shared sacrifice, I really just want to underline, because no one can go unscathed in getting the state of Connecticut back into a good place financially, to be able to grow the jobs that we need, to make our state much more prosperous than it is now, and share. The Danbury, believe it or not, the recession, which supposedly ended 18 months ago, has been better off in jobs and employment and unemployment than the rest of the state, certainly the rest of the country. So we're kind of in a little bubble when it comes to that. We're slightly better off. And we need to do the kinds of things that we've done in the greater Danbury labor market that makes this place more job friendly. And that is by having a very educated workforce. And that means the public school systems in Western Connecticut have to be able to prepare their students for jobs that exist here, especially now. And Dan and I started this morning, and Mike talking to the people at West Connecticut State University, the message was the same, just on the higher education level. So we've got this massive job ahead of us. And let me just say, there's a lot of people who are saying, you know, don't raise taxes, do more cutting. And remember, the only thing we haven't cut at all, the governor hasn't cut at all, is education funding. So we're being wary and careful as we begin to digest what the governor had proposed, what people are going to be telling us. I'm so glad that he's doing this listening tour. He's going to be in 17 different places, including Danbury on April 6th, with a time and place yet to be announced. And we're all very, very open to any ideas you might have to be able to help yourselves and your neighbors, our neighbors out, as we grapple with dealing with the economy here in the early 21st century and the job market here in Western Connecticut. And thanks for having me. I'll give you a jam.
Thank you very much. Jan Giegler, and I represent the west side of Danbury and part of New Fairfield. Just to reiterate on some of what my colleagues have said, and I know you're going to hear it from Representative Carter and Senator McLaughlin, so I'll try to hit on some other points and let them, I know Mike's on finance, so can give you a little more background. But one of the big concerns we have is with the spending within the state. We have to the governor's credit, he has spoken a lot about shared sacrifice. And to his credit, he has worked with all the caucuses and asked them on how they think that we could rectify this really extreme deficit that we have. And it's really something that we really should have been starting on about 2 years ago. The signs were all there and nothing was really done to address the problem. So when you don't address a problem, it just increasingly gets worse, and we're kind of in that place now. And when you get to that place, it's always the hard decisions, and it's hard for all of us. And fortunately, we all sit on a number of committees. Most of us are on 3 or 4 committees. And our committee processes is we're all looking at new bills. And right now we're looking at new bills and we're saying, is there a fiscal note to it? The fiscal note, we're not doing it. So we're having to eliminate a lot of things based on that. But with shared sacrifice, you can address different subject matter, but you have to look at, well, how much of a shared sacrifice is there? With that being said, we look at the tax increases, the proposed spending increases. What I know our caucus has been pushing is the common sense issue of don't spend more than you make, live within your means, and government needs to do that. There's a lot of collaboration that can be done between agencies. The governor, to his credit, has proposed that collaboration. There are issues now that are coming out. I know we had some in public safety today that's between a couple of agencies that it's just not going to work. But when you look at 45,000 state employees and there's only 150 on the layoff list, I think we could do more. When we look at raising taxes, there's far more we can look at as how we can control our spending. We have state buildings that aren't being used. Can we sell them? Can we privatize Bradley Airport? There are a lot of different options that are out there that we need to address, because what happens with these tax increases, these fees that are also being increased, is that it's hitting the middle class. And the middle class right now is really getting hit hard. Not only with these projected taxes, but in your own jobs. I mean, you look at the number of jobs that we've lost in the state of Connecticut over the years. We're not bringing in jobs. We're educating our children, but they're not staying here because there's no jobs to just keep them within the state. We look at small businesses. We look at the construction industry, who people aren't working. We look at the self-employed who are not getting unemployment benefits. So that's the same middle category that we're hitting the hardest with this proposed budget. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done and a lot of focus that has to be given to every possible stone that we have to look at and be responsible. And I give him credit for flat funding the ECS formula. It's one of the more complicated formulas that we have in funding education within the state. But it's also one that has had to have work on it in a lot of years. And I know we've had proposals through the years. I mean, we actually fund, the city of Hartford gets so much money. It's the worst school system in the state of Connecticut, and there's no accountability. So we could be looking at those and looking at some of our areas, and Danbury just seems to be the forgotten city, that we just don't get our fair share of what we give and deposit into the state of Connecticut. So looking at some of those kind of formulas, where can we change them, what can we do? I think a lot of people really aren't familiar with the city of Danbury and, you know, what our population is comprised of. And Dr. Pasquarello alluded to mobility and issues like that, and we know that that exists here in the city. So there is a lot we can do. He's also put a deposit on pre-kindergarten that's in the governor's proposal. But on the other hand, we could do that for some of the children, but we don't have full-day kindergarten for all of the children yet. So if you're going to do pre-kindergarten deposit, you better have kindergarten ready for all of those children. And right now, it's just a select few that are getting to go. So even though we're looking at education and we're saying, yes, you know, we flat funded it, thank you very much, you're flat funding the public school transportation, the non-public school transportation, it's time that we're going to have to be creative. And this is when we're all going to have to work together. And as Bob alluded to, we have a really good delegation here in Danbury that really does work collectively together to do proposals. We meet with Dr. Schmatter, we meet with the mayor, we meet with Dr. Pasquarello just to find out what is going on, so that when we approach this issue in Hartford, that we know what the situation here is in Danbury, so that we can negotiate on our constituents' behalf. So let me just turn it over to the third.
Boy, you're talking about stealing my thunder.
Sorry.
That's okay. You know, I will be brief. Obviously, being the newest member, yeah, I'm the newest member of your Danbury delegation, which is, you know, really great. I'm proud to be here. But there are a couple things I'm very excited about right now, and the fact that we all agree and we all have common ground on education in Connecticut, and specifically in our districts, is huge. It's a great thing to go into Hartford and actually have something that's very important for all of us, and we all have common ground. So that's not only a benefit for us, it's a benefit for you. With respect to the governor's budget, I just did want to throw out a couple of things. You know, what's nice about this budget is it's not tricky, in the sense there's no gimmicks. It's right up front. It's honest. You know, they're not taking from this account and that account, sweeping accounts. It's right there out in the open. I love the fact that he's talking about smaller government. I think it's really important right now, because we need to do more with less. When we talk about shared sacrifice, we need to share the sacrifice just like everybody else. In addition, I do believe that there's more cuts. There's obviously more things we can do before we hit some of those big taxes, and I don't think anybody's in disagreement over that. The question is, you know, when we put this in a sausage grinder over the next few months, you know, what we come out with. And I'm confident that as a delegation, we'll be able to work really hard for you and make some good things happen. And the last thing I'll say is, and I'll kind of echo what Representative Giegler said, you know, none of this happens in a vacuum, in the sense that we're all in your own separate committees looking at different legislation and different bills, some of which has nothing to do directly with the budget or directly with education. But each one of us is keeping cost in mind. And there have been so many times when I hear about bill screenings and what's coming up, you know, is it going to cost anything? Does it have a fiscal note? I'm very happy to see that, because, you know, one of my things going to Hartford was I didn't want to spend money recklessly. I wanted to go there and do what was right and reduce what we spend. And I have a real good sense of that. And one of my you know, particular interests is public health. We've talked a lot about healthcare costs. And I will tell you, from sitting on the 9 hours of public hearing last Monday, that you know, we're watching it very closely. We're all there to reduce the costs of healthcare in the state. We're trying to find ways to do it better and do it smarter. So with that, I'll turn it over to Senator McLaughlin.
Thank you. Excuse me, I'm Mike McLaughlin. I represent Danbury, Bethel, Fairfield, and Sherman. I'm glad to be here, and I agree with my colleagues that the Danbury delegation communicates well, and we should be proud of that, because there are other cities where delegations don't communicate well. They're not necessarily on the same page. So even though we are of two different parties, we do communicate well, and I think we definitely come together on education. I'm a member of the first graduating class of Rogers Park Junior High School, it was called. So it was a brand new school, and that's why I'm sort of looking around and saying, boy, that was a long time ago. So I'm getting old. And I got to pick on the people in the back of the room because the teacher would say, McLaughlin, you're in the front row. So, I always came in and plopped down in the back row, and they never let me get away with it. I think that, just to put into perspective, and there's no magic bullet, so to speak, here to talk about the budget. But one of the best ways that I've seen to put into perspective the severity of the challenge of the state budget and what Governor Malloy faced trying to craft a budget is that if you laid off all state employees, and there's 46,000 of them, you can't balance the budget. That's how severe it was. So for education to be flat funded by ECS, Danbury nets, we're still off in Danbury state aid to municipalities. In other words, you've got education funding, you have road funding, you have some other smaller aspects of state funding to municipalities. I believe the mayor would concur that we're down about $450,000 over last year, but the education side of the budget has pretty much stayed the same. So we've fared pretty well, and there are some other communities in Connecticut that didn't do quite as well. And I've heard some that lost over $1 million in funding. Some of the bigger cities, perhaps more. So I think our attitude this budget year is that we must continue to buckle down, but find some creative ways to help one another outside of the normal process. So, for instance, anytime I'm with a nonprofit organization, I've been talking about some of the creative ways to assist education in nonprofit organizations. One of those ways was just announced last week when the mayor's Danbury Education Foundation made some pretty significant awards to classroom programs that gives the opportunity to fund some pretty unique things outside of the budget that's available to the Board of Education. And so the Danbury Education Foundation has done a nice job, and I think that there are other ways that parent-teacher organizations can participate in things like the Neighborhood Assistance Act and other creative fundraising. I think that's what we have to do our best to think about now, because the reality is that government is struggling to stay alive just to sustain existing services. And so we as advocates for our part of the services that are being provided for government, and you're the advocates for education because you're here tonight, let us take our energy and focus on, okay, government can only do so much this year. What can we do to try to fill in some of the void? And so that's where I encourage you to put your energy this year and next. In fact, planting some of the seeds this year will bear perhaps even better fruit next year, because we're starting to see private enterprises starting to pull out of this tragic recession. I had dinner tonight at JK, sitting at the counter with a contractor who almost lost it, totally lost it in 2009, but he's starting to pull out, and he thinks 2011 is going to be at least double the business that he had in 2009. So the point is that there are people out there in private industry that are starting to pull out and are once again thinking about their participation in the community and their generosity in the community. So we have to start planting seeds of opportunity to engage the private sector in the public school system. So I encourage you to try and be creative in that way, and hope you'll reach out to me for some of the ideas of success we've had in assisting both private and public schools in doing that, and reach out to the Danbury Education Foundation for their assistance, and even better, reach out to the Danbury Education Foundation to help raise money to put into the pot so that we can do more creative programming like what, Mayor, how much did you award last week?
Let's see, a little over 14,000. 14,000. Now, it doesn't sound like much, but when you're talking about some of those programs were
given special program grants for $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, and $5,000. That's the difference between 2 or 3 days of activity of special kind of programming that isn't available in the regular board budget. So that's what I'd like to leave you with, is encourage you to sort of think out of the box. If you'd like some ideas, reach out to me and my colleagues, and I know that we'll be glad to help in any way we can. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. What we're going to do now is to take questions. We're talking about education and education funding, so we do want to stay on the topic of education this evening. And if you have a question, what I'd suggest is that if you don't mind, if you can just come down this aisle, or if you want to go to that side, you can get a microphone over there for you to ask your question. If you have a loud voice and you want to stand up and ask it, we're open to that too. So, does anybody have a question?
Okay. I'm very concerned about programming, as many of you. Okay.
So everybody can ask.
I've been to a couple meetings. I know many of you. I am concerned about programming, but there seems to be a void in discussion on facilities. We're talking that we're going to have a population growth, a spread of students, more so in middle schools and high school. We've had this problem consistently in the past. What are we doing visionary-wise about facilities, and where in the budget are we finding these monies for the facilities that we're going to need in the future? I also want to just take this opportunity to commend the mayor of the city for the excellent job they did with snow removal, that we didn't have any roofs caving on any of our schools. But I mean, it is a very big, concern. And again, nobody seems to really be talking about it. So I want to thank you.
Linda, can I address that? There are two things really that are interrelated with facilities. The first one would be the day-to-day maintenance, right? You mentioned roofs and snow clearing. And that's something that we literally focus on just about every day. For example, today we're at Pembroke School, shoring up the roof, meeting with our insurance carrier. We're going to probably need a new roof there. And we also have developed an ongoing capital improvement program that focuses in primarily on sealing the buildings to make sure that they're weather tight and making sure that the mechanical aspects of the building, i.e. the boilers, work appropriately and are efficient. And that's a significant investment by the city that kind of goes under the radar and people don't realize it. I want to give you a couple of quick examples and I'll speak to long-term issues. One roof costs $1.6 million. That's on a size of a school like Park Avenue. So we're going to be doing Staley Ruff's roof this year in this fiscal year. That's not counted in Dr. Pasquarello's budget. That's offline. So you can see that, people think, well, it's going to be $1.6 million and I'll go up there and spread the tar, but it's not. It's very complicated. You have to engineer these roofs. They've got to be warranted appropriately, and they have to meet certain design specifications and standards. So there's a significant amount of money that we put into them. In addition, there's also other ongoing maintenance things that we're working on. For example, we're going to be replacing the boilers at Danbury High School, Broadview, and I think Middle Ridge. There's one other school. I'll have to check. But there's 3 schools where we're doing the boilers. To do the boilers in those 3 buildings, $5.2 million. Significant amount of money. While we're doing the boilers at Danbury High, it's kind of like at your house. We end up with, what I call skull creep of the project. Because at Danbury High in particular, if we do the boilers, and by the way, I think there's 3 super boilers that are as big as this room almost, and the new ones, there's only going to be 2, right? A primary boiler, then a redundant backup, and they're about half the size of the room. But while we're doing that, it'd be crazy not to do the windows. Because if you put an infrared camera on that building, and you're understanding the cost of oil right now, you're basically watching your dollars fly out into the sky. To do the windows at Danbury High alone, it's about $3 million. So we're already this year, just in basic maintenance stuff, have programmed about $10 to $15 million in ongoing improvements to our buildings that People kind of don't know we do, but we're out there doing it, not counting IT and fiber optic lines and all that other stuff. Now to speak in terms of the long-term vision. When I first took office, we did a major bond initiative that did things like added space here at Rogers Park, added an auditorium at Broadview. We did a significant amount of work throughout our buildings. We spent about $50 million to do all this various work. That was based on the projections that we had in 2000, which had changed from the projections we had in 1998. 1998, we had a study that said we were going to be losing students, and right about now we have about 7,000 kids in our system. Well, that ain't true, right? Because we got about 3,000 more than the study. And so then we went back out and did another one with new population projections, and that's what's driving our new discussions. Now, I want to see how we lay this out in terms of what our needs will be, but I will tell you that we have a task force and an internal committee that's working on that. It is going to be it's going to be a hard and bitter pill for the residents to swallow in terms of funding, because it's not going to be cheap. A new school is about $22 million for elementary school. People want a third middle school. It's about $55 million. It's going to cost you an additional $3 million to staff the building each year. So, we really have to be strategic about how we invest those dollars. Part of our discussions internally will be, can we utilize other buildings that are out there right now that aren't really schools, but might be a good retrofit to be a school? Can we break down kids into smaller groups? I think the era of the massive Danbury High School is gone. I mean, no community can afford to build that building now. That's a $150 million building. And to carry the debt service on that will, frankly, bankrupt it. Those are the kinds of internal discussions that we're having, and we're going to continue working on it. Eventually, we'll have a report out, probably maybe before December of this year, that'll help us make some choices going forward about where our best investments to go. And Robert, you want to talk about school construction costs?
The same point. Which the mayor's made some excellent points. And one of the proposals the governor made is where in the past the state would only help out with construction of new school facilities and refused to put any money into upgrading or renovating buildings to use as schools. He's suggested to us that get reversed and that we start providing money so that existing schools, especially with some of these very big capital projects, would get the state help. One of the things the state can do is borrow for these mortgage type situations at a lesser rate than a municipality can, and work together to look at the kind of these more novel, these innovative approaches to being able to provide space for a growing population. You're absolutely right. All the numbers I'm seeing too show that Danbury is unusual in that the population continues to grow and the school population continues to grow. So we'll have to put all that into the pack. We'll see what comes out as all of this goes through the legislature. But I'm hoping we'll be in a position to be able to assist with that new way of looking at fixing up buildings to use as schools.
If I can just add, Bob, I just want to in the past, the state, and there's a whole new way of thinking, which is really refreshing, but in the past, if you were going to build a school, every single school you built in the community had to have its own specifications, its own design team, okay? So what would happen is you get, every building looks a little bit different, and it's got different materials, it's got a different design, a different layout. And so each building costs a different amount to heat, to cool, depending on the kind of layout and design that you have. There was a real visionary person, I can't think of the guy's name, that started work for the New York Public School Systems about 30 years ago. And he designed 4 or 5 templates for elementary schools. You see those same buildings all over New York City, different ones, all built the same way, common template, lower cost, easy to heat, easy to cool, and inexpensive to build. And that's the kind of thing that you're going to start seeing the state taking us to, since they're footing a significant amount of the bill here. And also being able to take buildings that might not ever had a school before, and converting that by reducing some of the kind of crazy requirements for square footage per student, per space, and stuff that just doesn't fit with 21st century technology. And so there's a real commitment to do that, and I didn't mean to go too far.
And And I would just like to add one further point to this, and which usually gets overlooked when we talk about things like space and facilities, is that concurrent with planning for the long-term facility needs of the district, we need to find a way to fund in our operating budget those elements once the buildings are ready for use. How do we staff them? How do we put all the infrastructure in place relative to support services, teachers, et cetera, which all come out of the school district's budget. So on the one hand, you have construction, which is funded by the state and the city. On the other hand, once the buildings are built, it then falls upon the school district to staff them and to run them on a daily basis. And so the committees that have been established, I've mentioned several times at our meetings that when we look at long-term planning, we need to take into account what the effects will be to our operating budget based on the plans that are being formulated. And I think not to do that would be short-sighted, where we think, well, maybe it'll cost $20 million, but guess what? When that's finished, you've got an annual bill of $4 million forever. And we just need to take that into account when we do our long-range planning. But the groups have been organized, and I think we'll see a lot of output over the next year or so.
Thank you.
Just talking about that, I was going to contingent here. There's a proposal in the budget right now for the governor. I think it's section 16. It talks about the technical schools. Are you aware of that? Do you know where that's?
The proposal is that the districts that have a technical school in it would assume responsibility for those schools.
We're aware of it, and that's about it.
Oh, that's about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just so you know, we conduct our business a lot differently than anything you're probably familiar with. We all sit on separate committees that consider the very narrow focus of that committee. I don't think any of us sit on education.
No, you don't.
Are you the only one who sits on higher ed?
I'm on higher ed.
You're on higher ed? You're the only one on finance? No.
Not there anymore.
You're not there anymore either, and no one's on appropriations. So, I'd be happy to talk to anybody about what the Judiciary Committee is considering. Joe would be quite happy to talk about, consumer protection, because he chairs that committee. So on a lot of these things, police and fire, that's very, what do you, I don't know what you're Public health and energy. Public health and energy? Ooh.
And banks.
And banks. And you're on Judiciary and Transportation.
I have transportation.
And you have transportation. So you see the doubling up and the and what we have to face in our kind of little narrow boxes. So we all listened to the speech last week, but as I said Sunday, that's just the wrapping paper on the budget. And our nonpartisan staff is opening up the package and doing all the analysis for us. And it'll be a few weeks before we get that. The public hearings are starting. And until there's actually a budget that comes out of the Appropriations Committee and the Finance Committee, that's what we'll be responding to at that appropriate time, more so than now. Now it's just talking in halls and telling our colleagues what we're hearing from groups like this, and just trying to hash out some of the larger issues. So, yet we're aware of that. I think we all have views on how big that problem is, but I don't think any of us can actually see what the solution is going to be. We've got to see what the money is going to be like.
Thank you.
Linda, could I raise one question? I guess.
You want to raise a question?
Or ask a question of the delegation?
Go ahead.
One of the things that the governor proposed, which I found very interesting, and I just want to get a sense of the temperature of the delegation, was if the need comes for a district to do a reduction of forced layoffs, that those layoffs would not be based on seniority alone, that the board or the administration could consider performance of the teacher as a mitigating factor whether or not to retain them. So you don't lose all of your brightest right off the bat based on that. I just didn't know if they had any opinion on it, good idea, bad idea, no idea, whatever.
I'll make a comment or two. I think we've all heard about this. I think that it's one of these issues where the devil's in the details, and a lot of us want to hear a little bit more about it, how it would actually work. So I'm not rushing to judgment on such a concept, but I think we need to have those debates, let the committee process go forward. I'm sure that's going to be debated on the Education Committee, and I'll be listening closely and kind of forming an opinion as I learn more. But at this point in time, I don't think anyone really understands how that would work yet. It's more an idea right now in the broad strokes, but we really don't know the details of how that would work.
There's a bill pending in New York to do exactly that. It's already passed, I believe, the Senate, and is working its way through the House. That essentially, in the state of New York, they're facing over 10,000 teacher layoffs statewide. And so they're desperate to find a way to retain the best of the best. And this essentially eliminates the LIFO, last in, first out, layoff procedure, which is very common in government. It goes to a reward model, if you will, that takes into consideration production, attendance, sort of normal things that are taken into consideration in the layoff process in the private sector. There's a situation in New York where they have something called a rubber room, where there are teachers who don't teach anymore but are still on the payroll. This bill apparently will allow them to lay them off. So that's sort of an extreme example, but it's the same concept, I believe, that's being considered here that gives local municipalities more flexibility.
If I could make one more comment, is that I hope to not see any layoffs in Danbury, where our classrooms are already, in my opinion, too big. If we have teacher layoffs, we're going to be talking about classroom size of, I don't think I'd be crazy to say closing in at 30. I mean, numbers that are just hard to imagine how a teacher would handle a classroom that size. So I hope that we do whatever we can to avoid getting into that conversation.
I too feel that, with the size of the classrooms now, it has to be a real concern, because you're looking at what the configuration is of classrooms now. The teachers are, your mainstreaming students that when we were in school weren't mainstream. They had more special services. And so now you really put a lot of demands on the teacher. So when you're starting expanding the size of the classrooms and they're getting up to 25, 26, 27 kids, especially in the younger grades when they're just developing, is really an issue. But I really believe that, to what Mark was saying, that we should start looking at the performances of the teachers and who we maintain. I know Brewster just recently laid off 40 teachers for the session. And some of them are the young teachers just starting out. And it's really unfortunate, because you know that in order to get some of those getting hired, especially in the special ed area, I happen to know one young lady that got laid off. She works in special ed. And there's really a shortage of the special ed teachers in the area. So I do think it would be good to look at performance. I've always been one that's not, and I guess I'll get in trouble for this, but I'm not a big tenure supporter. So I would hope that we would look toward that model of performance.
Do you want to say that too?
No.
When you talk about the population in the school system growing, it's not even across the grades, right? It's
bubbling up. It's the lower elementary.
Yeah. Okay.
It's bubbling up.
Just one other point that's related to layoffs. We've struggled with decisions on reductions in services, et cetera, over the past 2-3 years. And what happens is the alternate to layoffs is cuts in other areas. So given a fixed pot of money, the board has made conscious decisions to, as much as possible, keep class sizes where they are. But that has its other impacts that you would see. Take textbooks, take supplies, take library books that get cut down to zero, so we can't replace that. So to every alternative that we have, there are consequences, and we can try as much as we can to maintain programs and class sizes. But again, given the pot of money, once we've done all the efficiencies that we can take out of the system, something is going to be impacted, whether that's class sizes and layoffs, or textbooks that kids can take home or not, or supplies. eventually will impact something, and what the board tries to do is to limit the impact to impact as few students as possible in the least way possible. But these choices are inevitable in the short term.
I shouldn't need a mic. No. First of all, I want to thank you all for being here. It's very informative. And then my question is, what is being done to identify children of undocumented immigrants, and what kind of an impact do they have on our schools?
Well, the only thing I'd say is that, there's a Supreme Court law in 1982, I forget the name of the case, but it was very clear that you cannot ask the status of a child when enrolling in a public school system. It's unconstitutional to do that. So you can't categorize kids based on status. So we really don't know what the impact would be, because we're just not allowed to track kids that way. Having said that, I'm sure it's pretty profound. I mean, frankly, we have a very large undocumented population here in Danbury, and there's a cost to educating those children, no question about that. But, we have to live within the Constitution and federal law.
Register kids, no proof. Is that what that means?
Let me correct you. The law is prescriptive in terms of asking their ethnicity and their background, that we're not permitted to do that, and their status. But what we do have, we have a very aggressive, active residency program, that if we feel that a youngster or family is not a resident, then we have a whole process and an investigation that we put out there. And it has nothing to do with their ethnicity, it's a matter of residency. And we do put people out when they're discovered. There's a process that you have to go through. We go through it, and sometimes they'll appeal it to the State Board of Ed. But if you don't live in Danbury, you generally either pay for your tuition or you're removed from school.
You don't ask for
I'm sorry.
immigration?
No, we're not permitted. We do ask for evidence of where do you live and why. We do have a whole process when you register to verify that you live in town.
U.S. citizen. So you could live in Danbury, but you can't ask
Resident of the state. No. Resident of Danbury, you have to demonstrate that.
You can't ask them if they're here legally. You cannot.
Why? We got to call Arizona.
It's the law. The United States Supreme Court. Hey, listen, I understand your frustration.
I didn't vote for them.
There's a 1980, I forget the name of the case, it's a 1982 case, but it's very clear. You cannot ask the status of a student if they're here legally or illegally.
That's so amazing to me, especially living there.
Listen, I don't make those laws.
Do you know how many times lots of channels? I adopted a child from Korea, and Bush's law established him as a citizen when he was adopted, but he does not have on his certificate, it says not proof of citizenship. And I don't believe all the crap I got to go through, and you can't ask if somebody is an immigrant.
It's probably the quickest way to end up in federal court and paying a whole lot of money to somebody to do it. I mean, that's just, we don't write the Supreme Court decisions. That's, President. No, I know, but it's frustrating. Look, I'm not going to sit here and say there's not an impact, because there is. It's something I've been talking about for the last 9 years in this city, and taking a lot of heat over that issue. But the reality is that it's undeniable. But unfortunately, we have to live, fortunately, we have to live within the law, but unfortunately, I understand your frustration, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Sure, okay. All right, come on, yes, thank you. Got one more here.
Hi, my name is Debbie Cortez, and I had a few thoughts as everyone was speaking. I think the last thing I heard was about the teacher performance, and it's really surprising to me that there's so much concern about rating teachers on performance. And, at my job, I'm rated every year, and if we're not performing, we're the first to go. So that's one point I have to make. I also have a question, if I understood correctly. Someone said that $23 million is allotted to Danbury for education in the state proposal. I'm wondering, and that the governor is standing to protect that money. If that's what I understood, then how can he protect it, and what's the likelihood that the proposal will stay intact?
Bob said I threw out the 23 million figure, so I have to answer this. Okay. Well, I think that the governor has helped in that he's really led on the issue, and I think you know, there's something to be said about the ability that a governor has to kind of get the message out, you know, to use the bully pulpit and of his office. And I think that he's getting a lot of support for his position on education, and it crosses over party lines. So, you know, I think there's a pretty good chance that his position on education will, you know, make it through the process and remain intact. He's led the way on it, and that goes a long way. Of course, there are no guarantees. It's a proposal. You've heard people say, you know, it's going to have to go through the appropriations and the education process and all the public hearings that are involved. But I like its chances, and I'm going to certainly be fighting for it. So, was there a second part to that question, or was that that was the whole question?
Protecting. And 23, the 23 million number that Joe referred to is in the education cost sharing line item alone. There's also $195,000 for adult education, $177,000 and change for non-public school transportation. That also the mayor uses for supporting education where's the public school? Then the public school transportation is another $718,000. So it's a bit more than the 23. It's another couple of million more or less. But all of those the governor has proposed holding harmless, keeping them at the same level as they are this year.
You know, it's a good news thing. It's better than a cop. No question about that. But I just want you to understand, Danbury is the second poorest city in Fairfield County outside of Bridgeport. Okay? The next largest city in the state of Connecticut is New Britain. New Britain receives over $70 million in ECS money. 70. We get 23 million. So while it sounds great that we're not going to be caught, the reality is we're drastically underfunded as it relates to other communities similar size to Connecticut. And there's a whole host of reasons for that, and it's the reason why the governor wants to start all over with a new ECS formula. And when I was in the legislature, I put in a bill every year to start all over and start from scratch. So I'm glad to see that's finally getting done. So it's all kind of relative. Also, think about your fixed expenses. Gasoline's approaching $4 a gallon, will probably be $4.50 a gallon in the wink of an eye. Same thing happens to diesel fuel. Same thing happens to electricity. Same thing happens to heating oil. So all those expenditures continue to escalate. We haven't received an ECS increase in a couple of years. So it's a really difficult job that we have. You know, somebody mentioned, well, we don't want any layoffs in Danbury. I wasn't implying that there were going to even be layoffs in Danbury. I'm just curious what people's opinion was about the first in, first out, or last in, first out rule was. But those are the challenges that the board and myself have to work on literally every day to deliver services to your children.
I just want to put one more little piece on that. You know, obviously you bring up something that's very important, and that the legislature is really what has the power. It's not just the governor. And the legislature, I think, from people I've spoken with, we're all very aware of with education funding, and we're all like standing behind that. But with that said, April 6th, the governor's in town. You work with you know, Mayor Bowden's staff to find out exactly what time and
7 p.m.
7 p.m. Is it place to
City Hall.
Okay, City Hall, 7 p.m. I was told the other day it might not be big enough to hold people in City Hall, but tell your friends, come out. It's important.
else has a question? Did you still have a question?
Dr. Pasquale, you made reference to the mobility rate. I think the board's going to talk about it being close to 40%. I think you should elaborate as to what that means, the mobility rate, what effect it has on the district attaining some of its academic goals, and what can parents do to help us with this mobility rate. The other point is, another question is, senators often use the phrase thinking out of the box. I think it's also worthy of an explanation as to what the administration as a board has done to think out of the box and come up with ideas to get funding in addition to what's provided by the city.
Well, a clear way to help us with the mobility rate is stop people from moving. That would be a natural, wouldn't it? But the mobility rate does impact our programming. I mean, in a way where we're held accountable from the state of Connecticut under the No Child Left Behind for what we call an achievement gap. Our high school and elementary school and another middle school were put on a list that qualified us for all of our schools to be on this, quote, list, which means that they monitor us. The monitoring is very specific, and in fact, we met with the groups today. We're judged on the growth factor, not how much a kid grows in a year. We have students that are growing 11, 12 months, what we call in an value-added system. So the youngsters that are here to stay with us, as I mentioned before, are actually growing academically. Our budget, I'm hoping, doesn't slide them back. What the mobility rate creates for us, we develop professional development, we have these programming, and we put them in. And as we put them in, we implement it, the kid moves out, and if it happens to be they're in right before or right after the exams, let's say before, and they haven't been through the program, they are then tested. And that creates the gap problem that we have. We know that in language, we talked about this last night at the board meeting, if a student is here, our bilingual student, for example, we know it takes about 7 years of just being immersed in our culture to understand how to respond and do well on testing. They may be able and capable, but don't understand the contextual parts and do not test well. The laws do not allow us to test them differently. Although, if you take the youngsters that have been in Danbury, residents of Danbury, and have stayed in Danbury, and move along, those kids are outperforming schools in other larger cities per grade because they're exposed to it. But even at that, half of them leave. So if they would just say to us, we'll account for the youngsters in clusters, I think Danbury would fare well. I really do. But because of the mobility rate, the programs that we put in, we're constantly catching up, which means that they have to come in, we have to assess them, we have to move. The teachers are quite frankly over the top on that assessment piece, but it's like a pilot driving without a chart. You just can't do it. The youngsters come in, we retest, and they move. We do have kids moving in and out. That's why we have a common curriculum. We've had to, it's hard to say, we have the 12 elementary schools and we have box top programs. Well, we had to really centralize our curriculum so that if a youngster moves about, we have pacing charts so that they're exposed to information during times of the year so that they don't miss chunks of knowledge. That's very important for us. So, we've implemented that. So it caused more standardization than I generally like to do, but we have to do that. The out-of-the-box piece is very simply, the mayor has a program, we have a program as well called the Adopt a School, and the board initiated it this year, and we're able to take donations in. A lot of them is donations of time and effort. We do have some money that we've been receiving from Scholastica and other programs. So we've tried to reach outside of the normal operation in order to bring some resources to the town. I just want to go to delegation for a minute. The ECS money, there is a CJ case that Danbury is part of the lawsuit. And in fact, the mayor and Malloy were part of the original group. They are re-identifying, and it was him reaching out, instead of us continuing in the lawsuit, to have the state of Connecticut achieve what they call a 50-50 rate. Right now, Connecticut supports schools less than 37%, one of the lowest numbers in the whole country. And we're trying to bring it up. So for Danbury, it's considered a wealthy town, even though we have all of our challenges. And we're hoping, as Jan said, to get to a system that would be fair and equitable for the cities. And instead of just dragging it through the courts, and I've got to hand him the law, and he's willing to have it come in and start having a conversation around how can we do this without going through the courts to help these towns. So I'd help you however I can with that. Thank you.
I'd like to go back to, Sal, what you said about mobility. And just for the layperson, you're using the technical terminology of describing the challenge of mobility in the schools. But just for clarification, we're talking about, due to certain demographics of neighborhoods, a child will be in 3 different schools in one school year, in some cases.
That's correct.
And so that sort of puts into perspective what the challenges are that is affecting our scores.
Got something in the back.
Okay, yeah. I just wanted to ask, regarding the growth that you guys said that, the city is projected to grow at a certain rate. Is that separated out between citizens and illegal immigrants, or is that's all combined too? So, like when they do that sort of counting, is there a way to separate that out? You just don't know.
Well, we haven't seen the latest census numbers. We'll get those probably early spring, so almost there. So another couple of months we'll probably have those numbers, and it'll be very interesting to see that. They do not segregate people out by status, whether they're here legally or illegally, in the census counts, and a lot of the funding determinations are made by your census tracts. I will say there was a really concerted effort to count everybody in Danbury this year, probably even greater than it was in 2000, in the 2010 census. So I'll be very curious to see that. And you can make certain, sort of educated guesses about how many folks are in the community that are not here legally, and but it really is just an educated guess. It's a very it's an issue that draws a lot of passion, it draws a lot of heated fire on both sides. I've certainly said my piece about that issue over the years, and while I want to make sure that we educate every child that's here, because I just don't know if we want to live in a community that puts people out on the street. Conversely, I think the federal government has really dropped the ball on that issue, has not enforced our laws, and it's just bad public policy to have laws in the books that you don't enforce. We try to manage things as best as we can, but it's difficult.
All right, we have another question.
A few weeks ago, you had mentioned advertising possibly in the schools if we need that.
Advertising.
You want to do an ad?
No.
Do some polluting? Right now, Bob Tapasek, who's head of the policy committee, we were just brainstorming how we can bring some revenue into the district legally. That is, right now we sort of do it. If you go up to the high school, you'll notice some banners. And we're thinking about their district creatively taking their website, and there are companies, Scholastica, other book companies that are consistent with the mission of the school system that are willing to come in and advertise on your website. And there are schools in Arizona, schools in Jersey. In fact, they just did some research to actually give them sections of blockers in the building. I really disdain that whole thing, to tell you the truth. But I think we need to figure out, as Senator mentioned, how can we bring other resources in? One of my ideas, and the board, we should have a grant writer. But grant writers are very costly. It would be nice to raise enough money commercially, get a grant writer, have the grant writer then write grants so if we get more money while we sustain it as a business plan. So we're looking at options. We're looking at some policy right now, as a matter of fact, if there's anything there we can do. We know in the state of Connecticut you cannot advertise on buses. That we know for sure. Although I just saw that they're looking to use buses for public transportation in the governor's law. So you want to rent my buses, maybe? I don't know. We're willing to rent them, I think.
Hi, thank you all very much for coming. I know everybody's talked about ECS. It's a hot topic. And I'm very concerned. You know, I think what you mentioned, the formula is outdated. I mean, the 1980s. So instead of going every 30 years, we should build it every 5 years and a half, given the demographics. We need money here. The city needs more money from the state. $23 million, as the mayor said. It's nice, but we need much more. So I need legislators and everybody to really share that we need to really get this model down, get this formula driven. You know, Hartford has way too much. I'm not saying they don't deserve it, but Danbury deserves it as much as they need. Thank you.
Is that a question?
Hey, it was a comment. We go comment.
Okay.
Go. Thank you.
We agree that it's something we work on every year.
I just want to thank you for coming out, all of you, and it's been very informative, and I appreciate it. I did have a question, though. Bobby had said something about Danbury being economically doing better than lots of parts of the country, lots of Connecticut. And I was trying to reconcile that with Sal's comment that the poverty level has gone up. So
Now, I spoke specifically about the unemployment level, which is lower than the states. In the Danbury labor market, the Danbury labor market goes from New Milford down to Ridgefield and from the state line out to Newtown. The Danbury labor market unemployment numbers are lower than the states by a couple of percentage points and significantly lower than the nation's. I wasn't speaking of any other part of the economy, just the unemployment figure.
How does the poverty thing factor in?
I can't help you on that.
I'm just curious. I can answer that one. That's the poverty that's mentioned is the percentage of students that qualify for free and reduced lunch. Okay. So unemployment, we may have more people that are employed, but again, they could be underemployed. The amount they're taking in could be less. So it's a different measure, but the 46% are the number of Danbury students who are on free and reduced lunch.
And keep in mind, at the number that Sal mentioned for free and reduced lunch, the unemployment rate, Danbury only, not the Danbury area like Bob had mentioned, was probably running around 3.7%. So we've effectively doubled the unemployment rate. We're at 6.7. Danbury only is at 6.7%. So that number probably jives with what you're seeing with free and reduced lunch. You've almost doubled the amount of unemployed people. So it kind of makes sense when you look at it.
Because we're seeing the lunch numbers across the state. Skyrocket. Good questions.
Actually, we're going to have two questions. One is coming out of all this discussion about the ECS. But I want to go back a little bit back to the population question first. I think it was about 2 weeks ago in the paper, it was noted that we're going to have a large development or the proposal for large development to be built in Danbury. And I understand the construction drives our families, which drives our, funding our budget. But I can't help to shudder to think about what stress all these new homes are going to do, not only on the infrastructure in the city, but also on the schools. What are we doing from the state side as well as from the city side to stop having that be our grand driver for our budget and look at other ways for funding? Because the other thing that I'm also concerned about is when Roy came out with his budget, they're saying that they might add more sales tax, and that's going to significantly impact the Danbury Mall. What are we doing to limit all this construction, save some open space? Because in the future, if we do need to build more schools, where are we going to build them if we're allowing all these other developments also to crop up? We're just not going to have space for any facilities that we might need. So that's my first question, and then afterwards, go back to PCS.
Let me, it's kind of two parts to that first question. Let me just say that one critical core point is the kind of development, if it's residential, that you have, okay? So we place an emphasis on senior development, 55 and plus, because they don't generate a lot of kids. And then the second piece of that is 2-bedroom condominium units, although there are going to be some 3 bedrooms built. We've done research of old condominium associations, new ones, and in between. And the amount of children generated by your average complex of 110, 120 units is in the single digits. Compare that to a subdivision with 20 four-bedroom colonials on there, you're going to get kids there, and you're going to get a lot of them. So that's, people sort of say, oh, these condos are they actually generate less services than a 10-house subdivision would. Also because when you live in a condominium, you pay condominium fees. That handles the plowing, that handles the garbage removal, that handles the sewer and water, and all this other stuff. The best kind of economic development are jobs and companies and all that stuff. That goes without saying. So we really try to be careful. In fact, about 2 years ago, before the crash, we had a moratorium for about a year and a half as we did this analysis to see what impact it would have on our kids and our schools in terms of kids and other services that we would need. So that, no question, that's a challenge. I will say that allowing Danbury to collect a piece of the sales tax revenue is tremendous for us. And part of what will help limit development is letting us diversify our revenue portfolio. Let us collect that dollars elsewhere so you don't have to worry in terms of, or maybe take a project, the community doesn't do that. That might not be the best interest long-term for the community, but will provide some short-term dollars, right? So having said that, this is, we think, is really the right approach. It's something I've argued for years, and I'm glad to see the governors embrace that. And I will tell you that because it's a uniform rate across the state, we're not going to lose any sales here in Danbury. We're still lower than Putnam County, all the abutting counties across the border, so we won't lose that inflow of dollars that we see. And we think ultimately this will be a really important thing for the city going forward. I'll also tell you, and I don't want to speak too long on this, but I will say that there has been an argument by some that say, well, it's not a good idea because a community like, for example, let me get a community on the other side of the state. Well, a community that chose 2-acre zoning and doesn't have any malls or any box stores, or they made a decision years ago they weren't going to allow those, they don't get any money. And the argument I have to that is to say, look, that community made a decision about what kind of community it wants to be. And if you want to live in 2-acre zoning only community, you're going to have to pay a premium to do that. But Danbury made choices many years ago to diversify our economic base by having a strong retail section. By the way, most of those 2-acre communities race into Danbury to shop at our malls and our stores, tear up our streets, go across our bridges. When they get in a problem at the mall, they got to call our police. If there's a fire or God forbid another incident, it's our fire department that responds to that facility. That also employs many of the people that come from those same communities. So we should certainly have the ability and the authority to be able to collect and be compensated for hosting such a large community, a large building or facility within the community. So I think it's a great start, and I think it'll definitely, initially, we're not going to see a huge bounce, but I think over the years, as it'll go, it'll be really productive. I'll also tell you there's a little bit of problem, and I was with Secretary of OPM this morning with how they calculated the sales tax revenue in the governor's budget. Kind of one of those oops things. And the oops was that many stores that have multiple outlets report through one headquarters that may not be in Danbury. So some cases you're going to see inflated sales figures for communities because the headquarters is there, but there might not even be a store there. In other communities, you're not getting the proper credit that we should. I actually think our numbers are underreported because of that problem. They know that, they're on it, and they're going to figure out a fix for it. So I think it's probably a good thing.
So we're definitely protected to get that percentage of the sales tax then?
Well, I think if we don't, and it's not replaced as the governor's budget stands right now, we're going to lose a couple $1 million, which, is going to be a problem.
The other point I would mention on growth is that it's not necessarily, the new developments may have some impact, but one of the reports that we looked at that's still being revalidated projected, and we had said this in one of our earlier meetings, that Shelter Rock enrollment was going to grow 57% in the next 10 years. And that's not new development. That's, when the demographer looked at that, it was the sale of existing homes that were occupied by long-term residents who didn't have children being sold to people with large families.
And a lot of snowy nights. Your own conclusions.
So we're kind of looking at all of the factors relative to new growth.
Busy at the maternity ward in the fall.
Hospital's going to be busy this year.
Yeah. September, October, November.
More questions? Are there any more questions? Okay, one more ECS question, please.
And just following the ECS, I know we're legislation for it, or we're going forward over it, but is there a way for the legislature to go and work out the ECS problem without having to go through the courts?
Well, there is, yes.
Because I mean, from a cost, you know, if
And then it goes back to the courts.
that would be a huge place to cut the spending.
That's why we sued, so that we could force some kind of settlement of this issue. Governor Rell's position was that she wasn't open to discussions about settlement. Governor Malloy's reached out to us, and there's a negotiating team that's being appointed. I think I'm on the negotiating team. I was asked this morning, and we'll sit down with the administration and try to develop.
Did you get the short straw or the way?
Yeah, I think I said yes. It's a good straw. She's really holding me to the fire. I think I'm going to have to do this. But anyway, so we'll sit down and we're going to probably do some kind of phased negotiated settlement over a period of years to get us to the level of funding that we should be at. Understanding that the state just can't show up with the check tomorrow. It's just never going to happen.
All right, I think that's all the questions. I want to thank everybody.